Perspectives in psychology. We need to look at different perspectives in psychology because there is no single reason why people think or behave a certain way. If you haven't already done so, please pause this video and download the student note sheet. We're going to start off with historically the oldest perspective, or sometimes called the psychological approach, called psychodynamic. And it was founded by Freud. And it's based on the belief that our mind has three distinct components. And of course, none of these can be seen, but he believed that we have a conscious, that which we are aware of, a preconscious, that which we know about, it stores all of our knowledge, but we're not immediately right now aware of it, and that unconscious, which stores feelings, thoughts, and urges that are unaware to the individual, but often influence the conscious experience that these individuals they chose for their behavior. So for Freud, early childhood experiences are very important in developing our personality. And if a child is not raised properly, they're going to develop some kind of an anxiety. And the only way to cure them of that anxiety and cure them of that psychological disorder is to uncover that anxiety, which is hidden in the unconscious. He often used things like projective tests, dream analysis, and hypnosis. We're going to watch a video now on the psychodynamic approach.
The hooves on cobblestones pierce the stillness of the earth. Soon, the food will fire. But for Simon, this would not do. An average instead, we so of studying
Okay, we're going to move from psychodynamic approach to the behaviorist approach. The behaviorist school emerged in the 1910s. It was led by John Watson and B.F. Skinner, and it would be really hard to go into any large university, major university, and not find a hall or a building named after Watson or Skinner. Their school of psychology, behaviorism, that perspective was very much a reaction to Freud studying something that you really couldn't see. You cannot see the conscious, you cannot see the mind. So the behaviorists state that observable behavior should be studied instead of that unknowable human conscious mind. The basic principles of behaviorism is that there are environmental factors that influence our behavior. And really, there's nothing that we're born with that influences our behavior. We learn our behavior, and we learn it because we are simply a blank slate, and we learn it through punishments and reinforcements. If we do something that is punished, if we, for example, don't do our homework and we get a 0, according to behaviorists, if we care about it, we're going to do our homework. Reinforcements are things that help us to behave in a way by rewarding us for good behavior or rewarding us for avoiding bad behavior. So, according to behaviorists, there's some kind of an environmental stimulus and it produces a response. And all behavior, according to a behaviorist, can be explained without considering our internal mental states, without considering our consciousness. Let's take a look at this video of B.F. Skinner, the big name of behaviorism, explaining his point of view.
Can pigeons read? This one.
Okay, so let's do a little quick check here. I'm going to give you some time. You should pause the video. And then once you finish pausing it and you've answered these questions, we'll go through them. So go ahead and pause. Okay, if you are done with this quick check, let's take a look at them and make sure you understand them. We have a psychologist who's trying to reduce a person's irrational fear of heights, and they're teaching them relaxation techniques and then systematically exposing them to higher and higher levels of a ladder while a person employs these relaxation techniques. So, what this psychologist is using is the behaviorist approach. They're trying to teach them to associate now relaxation with being higher and higher up. Because remember, there's nothing cognitive in a behaviorist approach. It's all about what you can see. So giving them relaxation techniques helps them to have an environmental stimulus of relaxation along with going up higher and higher on a ladder. The second one is a parent rewards their child every time they eat their vegetables. And this is a clearly behaviorist perspective. It's about rewards and punishments. If you eat your vegetables, you get a reward, you will eat them again. Now we have the third scenario where the person is seeking a relief from an irrational fear of flying, and they are going to a therapist who is analyzing their dreams and hypnotizing them to find the true source of their anxiety. And it turns out that the reason they have anxiety is because they grew up with helicopter parents. And those are parents who hover over them and constantly make them feel like they aren't doing everything they need to. So that is clearly, since we're talking about dream analysis and hypnosis, the psychodynamic approach, trying to uncover unconscious anxiety. And finally, number 4, Carl's visiting a therapist who is helping him to identify this maladaptive thought process, meaning a thought process that doesn't help him to survive. And he doesn't think that he is worthwhile. And so, what is going to happen to him? He's worried his suffering will continue indefinitely. This is actually a cognitive perspective, which we are going to, so it'd be neither, but we're going to actually learn about that perspective. Okay, so here are those answers for you. Okay, let's move on to the cognitive perspective. And this perspective actually does look at mental processes, what's going on in the head. So we moved from psychodynamic, which was a professional needed to look inside your head to figure out your unconscious anxieties. Then we moved to behaviorism, which was a reaction to psychodynamic and said, hey, we cannot study what we cannot see. So behaviors really were interested in how people responded to their environment, what observable behaviors they could study. Cognitive psychologists came back in and say, well, we're not saying the behaviors are wrong. And we're really saying, though, that there are processes that go on in the brain, things about how we learn, what we remember, what we perceive, the attention we pay to things, how we think. And there's a belief that those processes affect how we behave and affect how we feel. So let's listen to Steven Pinker talk about the cognitive revolution. Oops, sorry about that. Okay, so that is the birth of cognitive science. It's really the basis upon which most modern psychologists treat and approach patients. So let's do another quick check here, and I'm going to give you an opportunity to pause the video and answer these questions. Okay, so let's go over the quick check. Finding himself depressed, this was the scenario that we read about earlier. Carl visits a therapist who helps him to identify the maladaptive thoughts he has, including a belief that he is inadequate and his suffering will continue indefinitely. Cognitive perspective is the correct answer. The cognitive perspective would be looking at those thought processes. What makes Carl depressed? And is it something to do with how he's thinking and interpreting his life? Number two, using a brain imaging technique called an MRI, researchers have discovered that people diagnosed with schizophrenia have smaller temporal lobes than larger fluid-filled ventricles. Well, we haven't covered that approach yet. That is the biological approach. So it's not any of the ones we've studied yet. Researchers are studying what differentiates the cognitive process of recognizing something and recalling something. That is a cognitive perspective. Identical twins who have been separated at birth are studied to determine the degree to which they have similar personalities. Well, we haven't studied this yet either, but it's neither the cognitive perspective, nor is it the psychodynamic, nor is it the behaviors perspective. It is going to be one called the behavioral genetic perspective. So let's move on to that biological perspective. And by the name of it, it's a little bit easier to understand this one compared to the others. The biological approach or perspective believes that our behavior can be largely explained in terms of our genetics and how our body is made up, our nervous system and our hormones. We call that the physiology. And it's the only approach in psychology that examines our thoughts, our feelings, and our behaviors from a biological or physical point of view. A subset of that is called behavioral genetics. So it's related to the biological viewpoint. But in this particular perspective or approach, we're studying both genetics and environmental influences on behavior. And in the behavioral genetic world, the important question is, to what extent is our behavior and our mental processes due to our genes? And to what extent is it due to our environment? Some people call it nature versus nurture. And often twin studies are used. It's really important because, of course, identical twins share genetics. And they pretty much share environment, but there are some environmental differences among genetic twins. Identical twins. Obviously, they don't have the exact same experiences. So, if possible, behavior geneticists will try to find people who have been, they're identical twins that have been separated at birth, because then we know that their biology is the same, but their environments are completely different, and it allows us to study the effect of environment. So this is a little fun fact. Did you know that genetics accounts for about 50% of the variation among us all when it comes to intelligence? But it only accounts to about 30% when it comes to personality. So our intelligence is more highly what we call heritable than our personality traits. So we probably learn more of our personality traits from our environment than we do from our genetics. We're going to move on to another perspective, unrelated to biology or behavior genetics, and it's called the humanist perspective. And it was founded by Abraham Maslow. Humanists study human potential. They actually don't study disordered individuals. They are really studying relatively healthy individuals who are maybe stuck at a part in their life that they don't feel happy about. But they stress the importance of free will, very much unlike that behaviorist approach, and very much unlike the psychodynamic approach, both of which say that we have problems as a result of our environment. Psychodynamics say our anxiety comes from childhood experiences, and behaviorists say that we're a product of all of our experiences. But this branch of positive psychology believes that people can and want to make themselves and the world better. So let's watch a video on the humanist approach.
Awoken early by the chatter of traffic,
Okay, finally, we're going to look at evolutionary psychology. It is a perspective or an approach to psychology. It could be considered a part of biological psychology, but it attempts to explain useful psychological traits, things like our ability to remember things and to forget others, our perception, our language, as adaptations. And adaptations are mutations that have survived as a functional product of natural selection. Sociocultural psychology or perspective focuses on how adults and peers and cultural beliefs and attitudes all influence our individual learning and behavior. When we take a look at social cultural psychology, most of the research that is being done is investigating the similarities and differences in behavior and thinking across cultures. Issues like systemic racism are topics that social cultural psychologists study, and it's an effort for them to try to understand the roots of racism and to promote actions to eliminate it. But instead of looking at individual causes of racism, they rather look at societal causes. And there is a link if you're interested, if you go to the presentation tab and move to this slide, you can read a little bit more about social cultural psychology, but more importantly, about systemic racism and how social cultural psychologists study it. Now, when we talk about perspectives or approaches to psychology, I started the slideshow by saying that really no one approach or perspective can explain a behavior. So when we speak about levels of analysis, we're talking about the differing and complementary view for analyzing any given behavior. Because again, no single approach and no single perspective can explain it. So take something simple like the behavior of biting your nails. What can explain it? Well, we could look at it from a psychodynamic approach, which says that people might have an oral fixation. They have anxiety due to being weaned off the bottle too early when they were young. And it's sitting there in their unconscious that they're always anxious that they're not getting fed. The behavioral standpoint would say that people might bite their nails to reduce stress. And they've learned that when they bite their nails, stress goes away. So the individual continues to bite their nails to avoid stress. And we actually call that negative reinforcement. In other words, the reinforcement is the fact that the behavior is continuing because we are removing something that's bad. In other words, we're removing stress. And how about the social cultural standpoint? It's not acceptable to voice anxiety. It's often considered to be weak if you voice your anxiety. So the person finds another way to deal with anxiety and they bite their nails. So levels of analysis, there are many different levels of analysis. The one we focus on in this class is the biopsychosocial approach. We will learn another model at the end of the school year. But the biopsychosocial approach takes a look at the biology, that would be our genetic vulnerabilities, our physical health, any effects that drugs have on us, the psychological aspect, our coping skills, our social skills, our self-esteem, and our placement in the family, and then our social cultural